Hi, my name is Audrey Borders, and I will be talking about Lisa Hogeland's essay, The Fear of Feminism. In it, Hogeland is explaining how gender consciousness differs from feminist consciousness, and she describes gender consciousness as an awareness of women's vulnerabilities and of a celebration of the differences between women. Then if you go to the middle of page 718 on the left, she says, gender consciousness is a necessary precondition for feminist consciousness, but they are not the same. The difference lies in the link between gender and politics. Feminism politicizes gender consciousness and inserts it into a systematic analysis of histories and structures of domination and privilege. So the way I think about it is through examples. So a gender-conscious person might be aware of persistent male violence against women. However, a feminist conscious person would know that violence has long been a tool that the patriarchy has used to stay in power. So the difference is that feminism brings things into just a larger context so that we can challenge or identify oppressive institutions that wouldn't necessarily be easy to pinpoint because of how tightly woven they are into our society. One other tool of patriarchy is diet culture. In her book, The Beauty Myth, how images of beauty are used against women, Naomi Wolf analyzes how beauty is the centerpiece of women's culture. She points out that there's a sharp rise in eating disorders around the time that women were socially advancing, more women were going into the workplace, more women were gaining rights and exercising their rights, and all that was aiding in women gaining self-esteem. However, the diet boom in the 70s and 80s significantly lowered women's self-esteem en masse, and therefore diet culture we can look at and say that it's stepped up essentially to oppress women, and we can identify it as a tool of patriarchy because it's acting in the interests of the patriarchy. Feminism really just questions the nature of our society, it threatens the status quo, and I think it's really interesting and unfortunate how common rituals, languages, assumptions, just anything in the public consciousness that we take for granted or don't think twice about can actually be a tool of oppression or be rooted in oppression. I also wonder what other aspects of our culture act in favor of the patriarchy, but we haven't identified yet. Hogeland goes on to describe the difficulty or the burden that the feminist consciousness places on a feminist. On the bottom of page 719 on the right, she says, the central feminist tenet that personal is political is profoundly threatening to young women who don't want to be called to account. It is far easier to rest in silence, as if silence were neutrality, as if neutrality were safety. Neither wholly cynical nor wholly apathetic, women who fear feminism fear living in consequences. Think harder, act more carefully. Feminism requires you to enter a world supersaturated with meaning. So, dissecting this, the beginning of this quote talks about how silence and neutrality are not the same, and how it doesn't afford women safety. So women might fear the consequences of feminism, but just because they are staying silent doesn't mean that they are exempt from oppression or exempt from the consequences of patriarchy. And then the second part of this quote says that you enter a world supersaturated with meaning. Awareness of oppression and how oppression gets its tendrils into all parts of our life is a heavy cross to bear, because it means that you have to restructure your understanding of self and the people around you. You have to confront your own homophobia and your own sexism. You have to identify or empathize with survivors of male violence, even if you yourself haven't been a victim of it. which Hogeland points out puts you in a headspace of it could have been me, which is terrifying. Furthermore, to put a context on the women that Hogeland is writing to, the young women of the 90s grew up in a time where feminism was demonized, and anyone with any sort of against the grain politics was labeled as troubled or ill or from a bad family. Also, this essay was published during a time of extreme anti-intellectualism, which meant that not only was feminism icky and satanic and against family values, it was also just not cool. Another thing she points out is that socially, feminists are excluded, especially in the dating pool, because the feminist consciousness means that feminists might demand more out of relationships or require more respect, really, out of relationships, which in the early 90s definitely shrunk the dating pool. And so essentially, with all the ire aimed at feminism and all the work that goes into it and all of the restructuring of the self, Hogeland says, like, of course young women are afraid of feminism. What else would they be? Number one, why is the feminist consciousness important? And two, so Hogeland wrote this essay in the 90s, so I'm wondering what fears really resonate with you today, or what fears does Hogeland mention that would be preventing people from being feminists in this modern age?